Everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about finding your game's fit while leveraging an insight mindset. So when it comes to finding your game's fit, identifying opportunities and creating value for players is something we all like to lead with. While important, there are a lot of other essential and core concepts that usually go unchecked, making it a challenge to stand out even if there is market demand. Thankfully, our guest today shares how implementing these concepts can better define your path while learning from insights along the way, helping ensure your game's fit is in line with the market and your studio. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, and we're back, and today with us we have Chris Bain. Chris, how's it going, man? And thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, we are too, because we have lots to talk about. But before we do that, I just want to give a quick introduction to you. So Chris, folks, here is the CEO of Player One Consulting. And basically what you do is like provide, consulting services to studios, developers, publishers, all across the gamut in so many different areas, like in terms of like scaling, go-to-market plans. I mean, the list goes on in terms of your expertise, which is really cool. And I know we're probably going to dive into some of that in a bit more. But also, I think what's really cool too is just your past. It's really interesting, and especially with your involvement with the community, with the industry. Like for example, one thing I would like to know a little bit more is you've been a mentor at the Friday Club in London. Tell us a little bit more about that. That's something that really interests me.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. I mean, that is something I do. Sort of pro bono, I guess. It's a little bit outside of pure gaming, but I like it as a sort of slightly different perspective on what I do in the game space. And that is essentially doing marketing guidance for various startups at different levels, seed, Series A, who come to this group, who get together every couple of months. And in fact, we have one tomorrow, get together every couple of months. And they have two marketing questions that they have for the group. And then we sort of have roundtables where we discuss potential solutions, things that they could do to help move things forward. But what I always find really interesting for that is it keeps me aware of what's happening in the broader startup and tech world. And then there's some areas where it's very similar to the games world, but there's also some areas where it's very different. And so that's kind of sort of the fascinating thing about it. So as I say, it's something I've been doing now for about 4 or 5 years, fairly light touch every couple of months. But as I say, it just gives a different perspective and stops us getting too sort of railroaded into that game space on its own.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting thing to share, because it's like having these different perspectives and understandings of even things outside of the games industry and applying it. Like you could probably take a lot that you help there and apply it to the work that you do with Player One Consulting. But on top of that, though, I don't do Chris any justice here by just leading in with that, because he's actually been the general manager for Xbox, the Central and Eastern Europe area, for like I honestly forgot to make note here, but it's been like at least a decade, correct?
That's right. So I was Microsoft overall for about 13 years, 10 years of that at Xbox. And it was split 50-50 really between time on the business ownership side, the P&L ownership side, where I ran full business of Xbox, so console, games, live, for a big region, so Central and Eastern Europe. So that's Poland, Russia, Czech Republic, these kind of places. And then I did that. But also a lot of it was spent prior to that, a little bit more in detail on the actual strategy behind it as well. So the strategy and insights piece. So I guess there's sort of two pieces to that experience. One was what should we do? What should we recommend? But then the other was actually I'm responsible for delivering this, and I only get paid if we're successful. So yeah, so that was an interesting perspective to take.
Yeah, definitely. And like, like you said, 13 years at Microsoft, that's quite awesome. But one more thing to add to this, and this is another interesting thing that if you'd like to share a little bit more, you do have a PhD. And what is your PhD in?
Yeah, well, my PhD, my background there was in microbiology, in medical microbiology. So, like way back when I was at school and university, I was very into science and microbiology in particular. So I followed it sort of through to some kind of logical conclusion and spent 4 years at uni and then 3 years doing research in microbiology. It's funny, like as we sit here sort of post-COVID, thinking, whoever knew that people would all be talking about antigens, vaccines, PCRs, this kind of thing. But that's what I did for many, many years. And I say I loved it up to a point, but the lifestyle wasn't quite right for me. And I thought there was other areas I could turn my hand to. And that's how I got into the business world and ultimately games.
Yeah. And the reason why I find that so interesting too is, well, one, I'm finding out from past guests, especially, there's a lot of people, especially with like some type of like science background, that then end up coming to games. And it just seems like this such an interesting, and almost in a lot of ways, I'm seeing that it's almost like a very organic transition because of the types of skill sets that you develop from there too. So, but I find that just so interesting and really appreciate you sharing that too, because it's an awesome accomplishment, and especially how you're able to apply those things that you've learned from there to what you're doing in games now, which is really exciting stuff. So that said, I do want us to get to know you a little bit more, though. And by doing so, we're going to go into the Q box round. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's just a series of random questions I have here for Chris. So, Chris, are you ready for the Q box round?
I am ready.
All right, let's do this. All right. Name one thing that motivates you every day.
It's a potential to build something with Player One that serves the games industry as a whole.
Awesome. Now, what's the most helpful or impactful advice you ever received?
That was a really hard one, and it's tough to think about. But I guess one thing, and I hope I live it through the discussion we have, was always to leave airspace around whatever you're saying. Like if you look at an ad for a very expensive watch or a beautiful ring from Tiffany's, that in a magazine is surrounded by empty space. Whereas if you see an ad for cheap things on sale at a local supermarket, it's lots and lots of things all filling up the space. The same thing is true of words. So if you leave gaps and space, instead of filling it with then you actually add power to what you say and people listen more intently. So that's what I've tried to work with and listen to, and hopefully I can be true to that on our podcast today.
Yeah, I bet. And that's such an important one. I think another thing that can relate to that is like less is more, right? In a different way. But yes, I love that. Always leave space.
Absolutely.
Sweet. All right. And last but not least, the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
Well, actually, it's a timely question because I'm sometimes jaded. I've played hundreds of games over the years, and maybe it's hard for a game to sort of break through. But I'm playing a game at the moment called As Dusk Falls. It's a really interesting sort of it's like a narrative game, but I think it takes it to a new level. It sort of fulfills that interactive movie promise that I think has been there for a long time but never really delivered. So it's on Xbox, on Game Pass. I think it's also on Steam, but it's an interactive movie, sort of you could almost like branching narratives, but not only can you play it yourself, you can play it with others as well. So it can also be a social experience as people make decisions about where they want to take the characters. So I'm really enjoying that and actually excited to be playing that, when I get a chance in an evening. So that's my current game of choice.
Awesome.
As Dusk Falls.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing that and everything else. It's very insightful and good stuff that I think there's a lot that we can glean from. So appreciate it. Now, that said, folks, we're going to get right into the discussion now. And as I mentioned earlier in the intro, we're going to be talking about finding your game's fit while leveraging an insight mindset. So to kick off this conversation, I was thinking and being mindful of all this in terms of, finding a good product and market fit can easily become a challenge for any developer or studio. So what would you say are some of the traps that most developers and studios fall into during this stage when they're trying to define their product?
Okay. And what I can say is it happens all the time. And I guess it's good for me because I can come in and help people with it. But I think the first thing is simply not thinking hard enough about it. Okay, not really being introspective enough from their own perspective, from the perspective of the team, and from what a consumer would think. So really just even taking time to do that process. And we're not just talking here after the game is developed when you think, I should market this. It is right at the concept phase.
Right.
Okay, before you start putting money into this and time into this. I think the second thing is, and this is a pet hate of mine, is the sort of lapse into games, jargon, journalism, cliche. So things like, hey, it's a Metroidvania, or this is a Souls-light. All these terms, and I talk to hundreds of developers and game players. Everyone has their own view of what these things are. And by sort of using these lazy labels, you really don't get to the nub of what you're actually talking about, right? I challenge someone to talk about a Metroidvania and see if people suggest the same game. You'll get a dozen different game types. So what I would say is actually think instead a little bit more about really what is the core of your game? What are the key aspects of that? The sort of USPs or the reasons to believe about your game, right? And this could be, for example, it has, a unique art style. It has an incredible choice or consequence mechanic. It has, a fantastic synthwave soundtrack, right? The things that you think, these are what people will talk about when they describe my game, that they say, this is amazing, this is awesome. And I think the third sort of trap that leads me into that is people just put a 20 bullet point list of the features of their game. But that's impossible to market effectively, right? You need to really dial into what are the 3, maximum 4 things that are really important about my game. And so that can be a difficult discussion. And, you have to flush out a lot of assumptions and a lot of disagreement. But I think it'll be healthy for the game longer term.
Yeah, no, definitely. And those are really some good ones that you outline. And I think the one that really resonated with me the most too, and hopefully our listeners, is, not necessarily thinking introspectively, because everything else that you listen are obviously, other traps that we all can fall into and maybe not think too much about. But again, it goes then back to the thinking, like that whole process and thinking is I think so easily for us to move away from and not think about the importance of thinking. Like, where's that intention? How can we be more introspective about the game, the product? What does it do for the team? So many things there. So I love that you led in with that one, because I don't know if you agree with me. I'm sure you do, but it's just like, this is something that's overlooked time and time again. And we just need to be more introspective with ourselves.
Yeah. And I think I understand why it's so difficult to do this, because we're so busy and we have so many things that are urgent. And this really takes a lot of time to do that, right? Where you're not disturbed, where you don't have messages coming in, when you don't have meetings. So I always urge people to clear out some time with their team to do this. And oftentimes I'll come in and try and support them and enable the discussion a little bit. But certainly putting aside that time to do this rather than say continually pushing it kicking the can down the road on this one. Just take that time to do it. It is difficult, but it's worthwhile.
Yeah, because if you keep kicking that can at that certain cadence or whatever, you might find up you kicked it in the direction you did not want to go in.
Absolutely. This happens all the time.
So with that in mind, I want to kind of like shift a little bit about like, actually finding like, what the right product and market fit is. So like, for example, finding demand or let's say even improving the value of products in a market is kind of typically a starting point most people take when they're developing a commercial product. So is that all that's needed to build a strong foundation, or are there other core principles that studios should be focusing on too?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it leads me up the value chain almost, to use a bit of jargon. That product, that game that a studio creates, it doesn't sit in a vacuum. It sits as part of a portfolio, probably either an existing portfolio or one that the studio wants to develop. And that portfolio sits as part of the studio itself. That, we all know the great studios and the kind of games they make. If someone says this is a BioWare game, I know what that game is like. If someone says this is a Guerrilla game, I know what it's like. If someone says this is a Turn 10 game, we have these associations. We know what the expectations are. There are certain things that permeate everything that studio does, from how it shows up in press, on social, but most importantly through its games. So I think what you can do is make sure that you've actually got those business foundations right for your company, and then you sit your product within it. And I often start with this with companies. I go in with a go-to-market, and then we work back up. I call it unpeeling the onion, right? We work down to see exactly what's underneath here. What is your studio about? What are you trying to achieve? What is your vision? And I put it that I always try and make sure that when we get onto this and thinking about a company's strategy, that we start with the vision. So that, like, what are we trying to achieve, both personally and as a company? Like, where is the North Star? Where are we headed? What the mission is. So what do we do? If I meet someone in an elevator, Phil Spencer says, "Hey, tell me what your studio is about. What do you guys do? What's your kind of 30-second literally elevator pitch, right? Something that summarizes it." And then thirdly, what are the values that you have? And actually, games companies are very value driven in my experience. They tend to be a sort of strong sort of code or sort of sense of this is how we do things. But I think making that explicit so that everyone in your team, everyone that you hire, all your partners understand this is how we do things around here. This is what we believe. This is what we hold true. This is the stuff we won't do. And just getting that written out. It's funny. Everyone says, "Oh, we have values," but then when you ask around, it's not always clear to everybody. And I think this is just one of the sort of challenges of growth. When you start off and there's 3 of you, that's great. By the time there's 53 of you, it's pretty hard to work out what the consistent values are if you haven't written it down. So all those 3 things, mission, vision, values, I would say are fundamentals that you then sit your product and its go-to-market within.
And those are such really important core concepts because, think about it. If we're just simply leading with, and I say this all the time in the show, we know how important it is, but if you're simply just seeing where there's demand and how are you serving your audience, that stuff is still important. But if you don't know that core reason for what you're doing, why you're doing it, how does it apply to your team? What is that vision? What is that shared vision, mission? And where are you taking, and how are those things contributing to the value that then is going to fill that market demand, that then is going to cater to that audience? If those aren't defined, that could really paint a different direction in terms of how things are going. Like we said with the can kicking, right? It's like those things are so important. And what I loved what you kind of finished up there, and it was actually going through my head as you were like summarizing and finishing that thought, was it creates clarity. And hey, we're in an industry where everything's happening. We're all busy and stuff. So the more clear that we have clarity around what we're doing, our intentions and everything, is just going to be that much more beneficial. Because again, it goes back to that North Star you were talking about. Without the North Star is that level of clarity. And without it, it can just make things all that much more challenging.
That's right. And that's why I think it's so important to have this process at the beginning of the development, because what will happen as you get more and more people, and I'm not a producer, but I talk to a lot of producers, and it's their, someone described it quite nicely to me. They said the different teams keep pulling the blanket over to them, right? And I thought that's exactly right. What happens is everyone, if it's not very clearly defined what your game is about, and maybe what your studio is about, every team, the tech team, the art team, the audio, they all make their own assessment of it. And then what happens at the end is you get something that's disjointed. It doesn't have an appeal for any one audience. It has little bits and pieces all mashed together. And so I think getting this stuff thought through at the beginning really helps to have a smooth development. And I have actually seen one of my connections that had done quite a lot of academic research on this. And he had said, the one thing that causes a failure of a game development is a lack of a shared vision. So for me, that was quite validating. I felt, okay, that connects what I say about the overall company to the success of a game development project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love that analogy you used too with the blanket. Everybody's trying to pull that, and it's like if people are left out in the cold or getting cold from not having that blanket, then that can't really help contribute to the greater good things. Everybody needs to be at their best and in the know, so to speak, to really be able to fulfill those visions, those goals, everything else that comes with it. Well, with that said, I want to kind of steer things in a little bit of a different direction too, as it might relate to, the actual development of a product or really focusing on particular products. So let's say even if say a studio does identify a great opportunity or market demand for a product. Hey, there's these games out in the market. Everybody likes this kind of game, but at the same time, there's I wish this could be done, or man, they did this poorly, and no one's fulfilling that need, that demand, right? So let's say studio finds that opportunity, whatever it may be. Let's say though, if there is that thing that's great opportunity, let's say that the resources or skill sets that studio has might not be able to support the scope of maybe what they currently see as that. What would you say is maybe a good way to approach scenarios like this? And what are potential options to consider? So let's say we're not being too ambitious with these great opportunities that exist.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I actually, what I found in my dealings with a lot of developers is that approach, which, by the way, I think has a lot of merit, right? So looking for the gap and saying, here's the opportunity. That's a lot more rare. So that's the sort of thing I see in more the general tech world, where people go, hey, here's the market opportunity. I need an app, right? Let's get some developers and we build the app to enable that opportunity. And we all, have a great business. We make out like bandits and everyone's happy. But that's typically what happens because of the creative nature of game development. People and studios come and say, this is just the game we wanted to make. I wanted to make since I was 9 years old. I wanted to make this. It's in me, and now it's out. So they sort of birth this thing, and it meets their needs, but the challenge is to bring it to market. Okay, so I think what you were talking about there, I think, is a very mature and thoughtful approach to take. Very business focused, very commercially focused, and I think it probably sits behind lots of very successful games companies. What the challenge there is saying is almost working backwards from the product. So the game you've got, and you think, this is the potential, this is how much it could sell, this is how much money I think it would make. And as I say, one of the things I do from back in my days, Xbox, when I used to do all the forecasting for games and for consoles, I now help some companies with doing their forecasts, getting closer to realistic numbers they could do. What that does is that sets out, okay, this is how much it could make back. Okay, thereabouts, ballpark figure. So is it worth me going for it? Say, okay, I think it is worth me going for it. So it's quite structured, but you'd look and say, this is my capability right now. This is what I can deliver right now. I have a team of 20 people, okay, but actually this game is ambitious. It needs to be a team of 60 people to make it. So, what is the gap? Who do I need to hire? What technology do I need to get? Do I need live ops? Do I need mocap equipment? Do I need to get a new premises? It's really understanding what would be required for that. And once you have that, so you see that there's an opportunity there, you've sized it, you look at the gap, the capability gap, if you like, you say, actually, how do I fill that? And it comes down to money. Right? Practically, you need to get it funded. It's the nature of our business. It's a very cash flow poor business. You put all the money in up front, and then you have to wait for a while. And there's the three main ways of getting funding for that I see. And by the way, this is a question I get all the time. Like, can you help me with funding? So I've thought a lot about this. So, but it really splits into three forms, and each has their own pros and cons. So the most simple one is the one that probably most of your listeners are familiar with, project finance. So maybe going to a publisher saying, hey, like, I need this money up front, I'll go make it, and then you could market it and we split the proceeds. Kind of like, I would say it's like the book industry. It's like a book advance. Go write this book. Okay, here's some cash. So there is that. And then there is the equity piece. So this might be going to an angel investor or a fund or a VC and saying, hey, this company is going to the moon. This is a rocket ship, jump on board. Give me some money. I give you 15, 20% of my business. So that's the second one. But that's a different shape, right? It's a different thing you're aiming for. So I say to people, you want one or the other, right? They're not really interchangeable because the end point is different. And then the third piece, and this is, you could put it under maybe the bootstrapping kind of, or more sort of organic growth umbrella, but it's variously work for hire, co-development, this kind of stuff, which is, okay, work with it's key to keep your team together, right? If there's not an urgency, like a real urgency to get that money now, and you think, a year from now would be okay, or 2 years from now, go and work on co-development projects, go and do some other contracts, become a sort of profitable ongoing business, and then use that cash pile to fund your expansion and build this great new product. And of course, that last one, that's really interesting because different companies, different studios have a different approach to it. Some absolutely embrace it and go, yeah, we're good. We love this. We're good. We can really run this. We have a sales pipeline and are highly efficient in that way. Others, it's sort of holding their nose, going, oh, I hate this. I just want to make my own IP. I really think you have to think about the culture of your studio before you go down that path. But I think that could be the third way to close that gap. So, it comes down to money, right? But if you at least know what you're asking for, and then who you want to ask, you're sort of halfway there, right?
Yeah. No, and I loved how you started that and broke it down because, first and foremost, you're like, you defined, I love how you repositioned it a little bit in defining that, hey, you know what, this is kind of like two groups that this could be coming from. And I then took that and defined it as you have your creative types, whoever you may be, wherever you may be in your journey. Typically, when we might see that from someone who's just getting started type situation, earlier studios, things along that line, to kind of the business foundational business outlook type perspective. And I think that's really important, because even by defining those two, it allows, I think, people to be maybe a little bit more introspective in terms of where they are on their journey, what they know, what their mindset is and everything. Because then the next steps because, bottom line comes down to resources, and a big resource is typically money, right? And then when you define that, it's still then, by defining that, that's still really applicable to both of these crowds. It's just how you go about those at that time in the journey might look a little bit different, or you might have to think things a little bit differently. But even, I think I jumped ahead real quick, but even when you start breaking things down about the importance of, okay, what's this project we want to work on? Great opportunity here, but what does that really mean in terms of scope? What does it mean for a team? Is my team on board with it? How much more hiring? Like, all these other factors are probably things that we don't necessarily consider. Or I think the flip side is, do you really just have to go after this opportunity? Because if it means that you're not playing to your strengths, so to speak, and it doesn't do well, how does that, on the negative side, how does that reflect the studio as a whole down the year? Is it going to change whatever plans you have in place? There's so many things, but I really appreciate you breaking those things in that way, because again, it's applicable to people wherever they are on their journey, and you really have to look at those things that way. And how you broke it down, I think, was a great way of how so many things we talk about are relative to everybody, but yet they're also very different.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And as I say, one of the things I always try and avoid this sort of generic cookie cutter approach. Right? I think that's the danger. I mean, and when I talk to people, I often try to because how did I learn these things? I learned by being in the room when smart people did stuff, and either it worked or it didn't. And that stays with you. That stays in your mind, that you see this stuff happen. You can summarize all that in bullet points, and that's great for sort of memory and recall. And here's my sort of 3-part plan. But ultimately, it's about building up a set of experience, or having access to experience, for people who can make decisions and say, with all the information that we have, and I think we may be talking about this later on, all the information that we have, how do we make the decision that's best for us now?
Right.
This gives us some things to think through, but actually, in the end, it's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, it's like we're on the same page here. Because as you're saying this, I'm like, oh, this is a great segue into our next section, which is, we have all this creating a plan and, this stuff, because that's just basically where we're going with this conversation. But also, leveraging a little bit with information or insights. So with that in mind and everything else, having clarity and a unifying vision, define objectives and some goals, everything we kind of talked about just a moment ago, they don't necessarily always translate directly into actionable steps. So
Yes.
with that being the case and everything we talked about up to this point, what would you say are some examples of how these things can be broken down into a go-to-market plan?
Yeah, it's a big question. There's a lot there, a lot to unpick, as they say. So I guess we all have these kind of light bulb moments, things when you go, there's something I know that no one has really sort of mentioned to me before. And I think this came to me when I was running this business insights and strategy group at Xbox. And we were in an EMEA team, and there was an equivalent team in the US based up in Redmond, who were, very good, very smart people. They were staffed up much more than us, maybe 50 people. We had 5. So we were always working pretty hard trying to prioritize what should we do? What should we do in our team? What can help the business be really successful? What can help the studios, the marketing teams, and things like that? And I got asked a lot, hey, Chris, could you kind of do a cut of these numbers? Can you go and find some insights? Can you go and, run the numbers on this?
Yep.
I was always trying to, I can't clone myself. I'm only one person, right? So I'm always trying to make the best use of the time I had. So what I would often do was say, well, okay, what question are you trying to answer? Like before I go and do this, what will you do with the data I give you? That was like my first response. And, sometimes people went, actually, it's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that. And I see this all the time. We say, I need to see more data, bring on more data. Somehow the right answer will magically appear from all this data. And it doesn't, okay, or very, very rarely. What you need to do is think, actually, what is the decision I want to inform with this data? And even before I have started to look for it, I need to think about assumptions. So for example, I don't know, it could be, do I go premium model or free to play, right? So you might want to understand, I've just made this one up, but it might be say, actually, what's the market picture for these two in this genre for these two business models? Before you even go looking for that and send someone off to do some primary research or go and read some analyst papers, you need to think, okay, what would be the answer I would get that would make me go, we're free to play? Or what would be the answer I'd get that says we're premium? Okay. And while you're waiting for the person to go and find this data, make an assumption. I say, for the moment, I will assume that free to play is the right way to go. And you continue, and you don't let the project stop. You continue. And when the data comes in, you validate your assumption afterwards. So again, and I worked with some great people, and I always remember somebody's, one of my clients just came to me and said, here's all the questions I want answered. I have launched the game, and it's a AAA game in Q4, and it's 2 weeks behind. It's 2 weeks after launch, and it's 25% behind its budget. Do I spend more money on TV ads or not? So, okay, good question. And, the consensus from his team was, yes, you should. But I went and did the numbers, looked at a bunch of different data, triangulated it, and said, no, you shouldn't, because it's good money after bad. It's sunk cost fallacy. You're wasting your money. It won't turn it around. You need to think of something else. But that was actually quite easy in a way, because I had a specific question to go and answer. If someone said, just go and look at the dynamics of post-launch, share of voice, okay, I'd go and do that. But when I came back with data, what would anyone do with it? They just go, that's interesting. And I feel my sort of mantra is, if the only thing you can say when you get a bunch of data back is that's interesting, then it's probably not been the most effective process that you've gone through.
Yeah, no, very interesting points. And I agree. I feel like there's so much out there, or so much that happens when, hey, we have all this information, but what does it ultimately mean? Or other than just simply that's interesting aspect of it. So I guess I guess I'm a little curious. I want to dive into this a little bit further too with that information. What are some, and let's say you did provide that example with like, hey, and again, and like you said, it was very specific too. Like, should I, do TV ads or not? Right. And then you're like, well, all the information. But let's say for people that are either semi-actively engaged with either metrics or other types of results or information that they have, and they're seeing this and they're just keep going, that's interesting. What are like either strategies or different ways to approach that information that they can then go and be like, okay, clearly this is a good direction for us. This campaign we just ran, it's checking off all the boxes in terms of gaining wish lists or gaining followers or whatever that result may be. Is it simply just looking at the bottom line figures of those things, or are there other insights or information that can maybe paint a little bigger, clearer picture? Because we know sometimes that information can be a little deceptive. Like say, hey, we got a ton of wish lists, but let's say there were poor quality wish lists, which is always hard to tell these things. So what are good ways we could take some of this information and not just look at it and say interesting, but actually be helpful in terms of what are those next steps that we take?
Okay, that's great. I mean, I absolutely agree. And wish lists, I mean, when I first started on my own and really was started player one, and I started working closely with the sort of PC developer crowd, and I was like, wow, you really are into wish lists, aren't you? I mean, and they are important, but let's say their importance is probably magnified by the fact that everyone can see it, right? That's probably why everyone talks about it. It's the kind of easiest. And you're absolutely right. There is, a huge variation in quality, and you're always trying to find the sort of right metric. There's a couple of things I think you can do. I think obviously, first of all, coming back to this sort of discussion about the strategy, sort of saying, what are the decisions? Like it's almost like a branching path through the forest, right? What's the strategy I'm going to take? Left, right, here. I'm going to publisher, no publish, or self-publish. Do I do this genre or that genre? Do I do free to play? Do I do premium? All these decisions. So work out what those are first. I think that's a great start, because then you know what you're looking for in the data, and say, and you can ask, does the data help me with this or not? The second thing is use as many different data sources as you can, right? What I mean, the magic happens when you triangulate things and you correlate things and you look and say, when that happens, this happens. Okay, all right, let's test that. Let's see if we can do more. Okay, and this is why I talk about A/B testing, test and learn. I think this is a great thing if you can set these experiments up, right? Oh, well, when we changed the assets that we used on our Steam page, we got a much better uptake, or this trailer worked better than that trailer. So putting all those things together can sort of help you understand it a bit more. One of my rules of thumb is always beware of any metric that's a ratio, right? So it's, how many, I don't know, what's the average, like ARPU, for example, right? That's great. But actually, if you've got a high ARPU, but it's because you've only got a few users, well, that's not really great, is it? Right.
Right. Yeah.
It's like profit and profitability. In my old days, they used to say, you can't spend a percentage. Right? It's like, I don't care about the profit. How many dollars is that? Okay, percentage is great, but tell me the dollars. So the same works for a lot of these. Think about, what is that metric actually trying to tell me, and does it inform those strategic decisions? And I think the final thing is you can just chill a bit as well. It's games. I've worked with data scientists who are really cool, smart, pointy-headed people who just work with algorithms and numbers and statistical tests, and they come to the games industry. And I remember one guy, he just said, after about 2 months working through this, he said, "It's really random, isn't it?" I said, yes, it is. Right? it's because we're at this sort of point where it's an emotional, it's a cultural, it's an artistic endeavor, as well as a sort of commercial product. So it's very hard to find these hard and fast rules. There's a balance between the data and the science, and then also the sort of intuition and the gut feel. And I think you should always, you should be aware that gut feel plays a role. You should identify it and say, this is gut feel, this isn't data driven, but I think we have enough to go with this and be decisive. I think when someone gets the kind of magic algorithm that tells you this is a hit game or it's not, that person, I mean, they'll be buying their super yacht, and traveling around the world on it, right? Because it's the holy grail. But I don't think we're close to that yet. So I think there's still a lot of room for that sort of broader experience, gamer knowledge. It does play a role still.
So maybe sometime soon it might be Chat GPT that comes up with
Well, it could be. It's definitely in there. I knew we had to get generative AI in there somewhere.
It just popped in my head. But no, I mean, you know what? I love everything you just said, because it's really looking at things very holistically. Because let's face it, you said you already defined some specific people, within their field, the types of jobs that they have that can be very data centric. And let's face it, there's a lot of developers or people out there in general that are very data specific. But I love the example you're like, you can't buy anything with the percentage. And from my own experiences in my past, with marketing as a whole too, I love the example of people who are like, oh, I have a 50% conversion rate. That's great. But if you only had 2 people that went to your page and one of them ended up being a wish list, well, that number doesn't mean anything now, does it? In terms of having a commercial product or whatever the case is. So that's another one. And then the triangulation, again, this goes back to the holistic aspect of things, because I'm in the same boat. It's like when you're trying to look at things indifferently, instead of just saying, oh, that's interesting, how does it tie in? Because I feel that a lot of the metrics that most of us have access to, especially with Steam, they're helpful. But if you're not taking other things, and I'll give a very specific example, you could make changes, try to A/B test in whatever capacity you're able to, see an uptick. But let's say you make that change and then you're not looking at information like Google Analytics, for example. And when you made that change, now people are staying on your Steam page for, let's say, a second opposed to, 30 seconds. So even though that might give a positive uptick, is it ultimately going to be something that benefits you in the long run? If people are coming to your page and then bouncing immediately instead of staying engaged on the page, I mean, that's one tiny little piece of information that can actually really provide you with more insight in terms of, was that the right change or not? Because other just percentages or other numbers might look great, but might not necessarily. And even if numbers are low, if you're getting lots of volume, it doesn't matter how low the numbers are, especially if the overall number, so it's all relative, and you got to look at things very open. But the last and final thing outside of these numbers, because again, I think we can get the devil's in the details, as they say, and it can be very limiting, but that gut feeling that you called out to is so important too. Just because these numbers look great, they're telling an awesome story. You have investors or whoever you need to provide updates and look at these numbers, but do they matter if you have all this stuff, but there's nothing to show for it? If people are, if people aren't engaging or showing other interactions or insight to this, then are those numbers really all that important? And I think those are, like you called out to, those are all things that we need to be mindful of and everything else, because if we're not, it can just allow us to kick that can further in a direction that we may not want to be going in. So
no, for sure. And I mean, this is the beauty of this industry, right? It's always changing so fast. You just get a hold of it. You just understand this is what works. When I started my games journey, it was very much all about retail and box product and get it in store and get it on those end caps and, ship it, right? Get it shipped. And look how it's evolved over the years. Now, there's some things stay consistent, some things stay continuous, but, the model changes all the time. So you're always still trying to learn, still trying to, work out how can I best harness this for the good of my own studio.
Exactly. Well said and summarized. Well, speaking of that, I know we're coming to time here. So before we close, I'd love for you to just give, and again, it might be some of the things you already called out to before, but if you could provide us with any tips or suggestions you would recommend to people listening today in terms of what are some good ways about, doing the things that we talked about, or what are the tips that people should maybe focus on when they're thinking about finding their games fit and leveraging some insights?
Okay, no, sure. I say probably the first thing to start with, and I think it's so true when talking to developers and people who start studios or are running studios, it's a very personal endeavor. And I always say, what are you trying to get to personally? Like, what will make you happy here? Is this, I want to build a big empire and exit, for a couple of 100 million and boom, I'm out of here. Is it, I want to grow a mid-sized studio and I just kind of run it for a long time? Or is it that I actually just want to continue to work creatively and not have to worry about, paying my mortgage or paying the team. I'd like just something that allows me to be the creative director. So I think try and understand what that looks like. Be thoughtful about where you're trying to get to, because that means you've got at least a fighting chance of getting there. So that's probably the first thing I'd say, and this, you can then build out from that. I think once you have that, and we talked about the studio, I think identify the journey that you need to make to get there. So what are the decisions? Strategy is about making decisions, deciding what to do and what not to do. So have a think about what those decisions are, like what are the decision points in that journey, and what do I need to help me make that decision. And then maybe just coming back around to our first point about games, think really hard about when you've got a game and it's even at the concept stage, what is it about? Like, what are the reasons to believe in this game? What are the USPs? 3 or 4 maximum. And then who will like this? So, and by that, I mean people who play either, other similar games, if it's a strategy game, maybe it's other specific strategy games. And what's their motivation for playing it? So, like, why would they play? Is it for the social fun? Is it for the competitiveness? Is it for the ability to be creative, like a sandbox? Think through those things. And if you've got those together, you can match your product and your audience. And the rest of it should, I hope, flow out, and you can start to think about marketing tactics, and that's the job.
Awesome. Well, really good tips there. I really appreciate you sharing them with us. And before we close, would love for you to share also how can people get in touch with you if they want to? What's your website? How can they connect? What are some great ways to go about doing that?
Sure. Well, I do have a website. So I'm at player1consulting.com. So it's all one word, and it's player1 with ONE, player1consulting.com. That's a good first point of contact, but I'm also on LinkedIn. So either Player One Consulting or myself, Chris Bain, PhD, I'm on LinkedIn and also on Twitter, on both of those accounts. So very happy to, have a chat if people are interested about some of the things I've talked about. These are very specifically the things I work with. I have a lot of packages that are appropriate for studios and publishers as well, of all sizes. So very happy to start that conversation, and hopefully I can help bring success to more companies.
Awesome. Well, Chris, can't thank you enough for being here today. I mean, these insights were just so great and valuable, especially because, I think a lot of the different perspectives and angles we discussed today were something that we don't necessarily always think about. So again, can't thank you enough for being here today on the show and sharing that with us.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I absolutely love the conversation, and call me back anytime.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.